Okay, so right before spring break, we ended with the Roman Republic, and I can't exactly remember how far we got in the Roman Republic. I know I set it up for you, and I kind of explained to you how things went in the Roman Republic, but I don't feel like we got all that far in it. And so I'm just going to go ahead and re record the information about the Roman Republic to kind of refresh your memory so you can get your head back into the art history game. Um, Remember that the Roman Empire is a very complex topic, and it can be hard to follow the line of succession. So I don't want you to worry so much about the specific history behind the Roman Empire, other than the major themes that we discuss in class that we see in the art. So the Roman Republic begins in about 509 BCE, and it lasts for 500 years. It lasts until the Senate names Augustus Octavian. Augustus is the grandnephew of Julius Caesar. Octavian takes out Mark Antony in a civil war, and it ends the Republic in 27 BCE. Now I know that the labels can be kind of confusing because I'm talking about Augustus Octavian. I want to make sure that you understand that Octavian, or Augustus Octavian's real name was not Augustus Octavian. Augustus is a title, like President Trump. It's Augustus is his title. Octavian was his name after he took office. So we're just going to call him Augustus Octavian so that we can keep that straight. But you are going to hear in other research that Augustus Octavian had a different name. Just know that he was the grandnephew of Julius Caesar, and that the Roman Republic itself ends in 27 BCE. The interesting thing about the Roman Republic, and this is something I cannot emphasize enough in this class, is that it incorporates vast numbers of people, languages, races, and cultures. And because of that, it creates a religion issue. The Roman Republic is very much like ancient societies that we've already studied, that they're constantly fighting each other for control of natural resources. And so they go into a country, they take out all their natural resources, assume the land, execute anybody who is not of use to them, and then they come back to Rome. And so in the Republic, you find that the people that are in the Republic as a whole tend to have different cultural beliefs, different cultural backgrounds. Just take Rome and Greece. Even though they were closely related, the Greeks had their own system of mythology. In Rome, you weren't considered to be as upper class as the people who were Roman themselves. Okay, so it most closely, in terms of ancient worlds, the Roman Republic is something that most closely resembles today's world in culture and character if you look at all of the ancient societies. The Western concepts of law, government, and the calendar all come from the Roman Republic. And the Roman Republic has a Senate and 2 councils per city-state. So they still have that city-state formation, and the patrician and the plebeian classes are formed. All men are part of a Roman forum, and I should say all Roman white men are part of a Roman forum where voting takes place to enact things in the community. It's the first democracy that Julius Caesar is in power. So let's talk about the Republic. In general, your goal here is to understand the great innovations of Roman architecture and how these innovations contribute to the expanse of the Roman Empire. We want to discuss Roman architectural contributions, particularly concrete and the rounded arch. and examine the ways in which Roman art is different from classical art of Greece. So let's talk a little bit about a line of succession. I'm never going to ask you to recall who took over what, but I think sometimes it kind of helps to get a big picture understanding of what went on in the Roman Republic. So Marcellus begins as consul, and then Marius takes over as consul, and then Sulla is elected into consul and is also elected as dictator. Pompey comes along, and then Julius Caesar takes over. Julius Caesar is the seat to the line of succession for Augustus Octavian. And Augustus Octavian takes out Mark Antony in that civil war, which creates the Roman Empire. So right now, we're still in the Roman Republic. We aren't at the Roman Empire yet. This is a map of the Roman world. You will notice as time goes on that Rome sticks to its control around the edge of the Mediterranean Sea, mostly because they're trying to control trade. If they control all the cities and the major ports that go in and out, ultimately they wanted to conquer all of Europe and consequently the entire world. But they really hold stock in controlling the city-states that are closest to the Mediterranean Sea. One place you'll find that becomes very important is Carthage in Tunisia. It becomes very important because it controls trade into Africa and into the East. So it's a huge portal of importance. This work of art is one that you've seen before. It is a work of art that is actually Etruscan. We looked at Etruscan before we started the Roman Republic right before spring break. You can see the patterning on the she-wolf's neck and down its spine. Romulus and Remus, the two cherub babies, were added after the Etruscan sculpture was created. They were added many, many years later. The whole reason that this particular sculpture became so very important was because there was a pope that fell in love with it and took it to Rome, and now it's at the Vatican Museum in Rome. And the cherubs were added to tell the myth of the founding of Rome. So in 509 BCE, the Latin and Etruscan kings rule Rome until Romulus and Remus come along and form the official city. There's a revolt against the Tarquinius suburbs, which lead to the founding of the Roman Republic. So that's where the Roman Republic comes from. It's sort of spurs out of Etrusca. And just like I told you before, all of the power belongs or starts in the city-states. And so the city-states, the Roman city-states overtake the control or gain control and conquer the Latin and Etruscan kings in all the Latin and Etruscan suburbs. All right, so let's talk more about the Roman Republic. This slide shows you sort of the structure of how the Roman Republic is set up. In the very beginning, all the leaders in the Senate are patrician. There are two social classes right now, the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians are the upper class. They're the top less than 10% of the entire population. And most of the people in the Republic are plebeian. Eventually, the plebeians can be leaders, but it takes some time. Eventually, Rome conquers the Etruscans. We just talked about that. The Samnites, the Greek colonies in the south, and the Carthaginians in North Africa. We'll talk about Hannibal in a few minutes. Each Senate elects two consuls. A consul is the leader of the Senate. They are powerful. They help to make laws within Rome. And so those two consul seats are important in terms of political decisions. So we usually associate a negative connotation with a dictator, but a dictator can be appointed in an extraordinary circumstance. So in the Roman Republic, a dictator was actually the one who took control of whatever problem they were having and created solutions for the problem. So while we consider a dictator to be someone who has negative impact on the community, in the Roman Republic, the dictator was the one that sort of um, rescued the community from whatever they were facing. Sometimes those things could be natural disasters. Other times they could be if the Republic is having a hard time in terms of someone trying to take over a certain region of the Roman Republic. They will send out the dictator to get a hold of that situation. So, also large natural disasters, floods, volcanoes, hurricanes, things like that. They would send a dictator to reestablish government control within the area and to get supplies and goods to the people. So, for about 15 years at the end of the Roman Republic, the Romans have been chasing Hannibal across all of the Roman Republic's land. Hannibal seems to be able to get one step ahead of them, conquer the area that he's trying to gain control in, and the Romans just keep chasing him all over the Roman land. And so they get smart and they decide that they're going to wait until Hannibal decides that he's going to defeat something else. He is the consul for Carthage in North Africa. And they realize all of a sudden that he has to leave Carthage in order to in order to take over a city state. And so they wait until they kind of set camp out in Carthage and they wait until he leaves. One day he leaves Carthage to go gain control of another city state, and they go in and sack Carthage. They pillage it, they take all of its positive attributes, things that they can use, take over Carthage, and leave. And they would have pillaged and taken control, so gotten rid of anything they didn't want or didn't need that caused them problems, taken the goods, including resources such as people, back to Rome, and just basically established control there in Carthage. The Romans defeat Hannibal this way. And after that defeat, the Roman Empire officially becomes the Roman Empire. So we're talking about Roman art. We talk about art from about 509 BCE to about 400 CE. That is a really wide span of time. So as we're talking, remember that you're looking at art that's lasted for almost 1,000 years. In terms of people, we talked about this. The Republic becomes the empire. They are polytheistic. Military expansion is what spreads their culture. We also talked about it causes problems within the culture because there isn't one unification of belief system. And the major figures include Marcellus, Sulla, Julius Caesar, and Mark Antony. This is a digital recreation model of Rome during the early 4th century. If you're interested in what all of the famous monuments of Rome look like, you can see them here as you look at this reconstruction map. Just to point out a few, this here is the Circus Maximus. That's where all the famous chariot races took place. The round thing here that's pretty dominant in the center is the Colosseum. And then you'll see the wall that was built around the Colosseum. So it was a fortified city. So why was Rome so successful? Well, Romans believed that it was because they lived by three virtues: duty, courage, and discipline. What that really means is duty to Rome, duty to the Roman concepts, duty to the Roman ideal set, courage to face maybe going into battle and not coming back out, and discipline, once again, continuing to do it over and over and over again, day after day. Now we know that Romans absolutely loved ancient Greece. They loved their sculptures, they loved their art, they loved everything about ancient Greece. And so the first historian's name was Livy, and he records in 211 that Marcellus, who happens to be consul at the time, defeats the Sicilian Greek city of Syracuse and brings back the spoils of war, and with it, the Roman thirst for classical art and architecture. Livy says the craze for works of Greek art. We know that they absolutely loved Greek art, and they were masters of copying. They create a new type of material called tufa. Tufa is basically ancient cement. It was a different kind of ancient cement than what the Etruscans used. It was a slurry of rocks, small rocks, and moisture. They used it as plaster, and they would create the building out of tufa and then paint it. The painting was called faux finishing, and it would look just like marble. They didn't have the money to make temples out of marble at this point. Why? Well, because the marble was quarried in the Aegean Sea, and so Rome is not close enough at this point or has enough control over territory to be able to afford the expense of carting it back to Rome to create temples, and so they do it out of tufa. Now, one of the major changes here that we see in terms of temple building is that Roman temples only have one point of entry. So you can see in the front here, there's a set of steps that lead up to the main entrance of the temple. If you remember, that is called the pronos. In the center, you have a closed-in cella. And then as you go around the building, you'll see a peristyle. The cella where the peristyle meets the cella, or the columns meet the interior room, you have engaged columns that are connected to the building. The ones that are freestanding, the ones at the front of the peristyle, are not connected to a cella. Worship still takes place outside of the temple, and only priests and priestesses are allowed to go into the temple. So this is a Tholos temple plan, which means it's a round temple plan. And this temple is a temple that was created with the innovation of the tufa. Without the innovation of the tufa, the Tholos temple would not be in the place that it's in. It is at the side of a cliff, and you have to go down a steep cliff to get to the interior of the temple. It overlooks a gorge. And so the innovation of the tufa allowed for building in places that weren't real common. Right now, what you're looking at is a temple done in the Corinthian order. And so you see at the frieze, this top part here, there's this like roping type decoration that is part of the Corinthian order, and then the capitals on the columns have these plant-like looking tops. Those are acanthus leaves, and that's how you tell that a building is in Corinthian order. This building was small. It would not have had much worship take place outside of the temple. And a priest or priestess would go into the center of the temple or into the cella by going down the cliff and up a steep staircase. This is the restored view of the sanctuary of Fortuna Primagina in Palestrina, Italy. It's done in late 2nd century BCE. The concrete construction here made it possible to build a temple on the hillside. So we're used to seeing these type of temples. We saw one in ancient Egypt. It was the Temple of Hatshepsut. In the Temple of Hatshepsut, because it was built in the side of the cliffs, the temple was created by removing rock from the cliff face. So this is sort of the opposite in terms of construction. It is additive. The tufa gave them the ability to actually add a structure to the cliffside instead of taking it away, or instead of taking the material away. In the Temple of Fortuna Primagina, the concrete construction allows for some new innovations in architectural technology. Those new innovations are the barrel vaults. You see continuous row of barrel vaults here in the center of the building. The building is entered through this small barrel arch, like sort of like a modern day stadium. You would go in through the bottom and come out into the top. You have barrel arches that are repeated here in the center, colonnades that support the base of the structure, and that it opens up into a tholos type space. Now, the sanctuary of Fortuna Primagina no longer exists. This is a reconstruction, a digital reconstruction that captures what it probably looked like. It was dedicated to the goddess Primagina. She's the goddess of good fortune. And it was an important innovation, or it was an important building because of the innovation of the barrel vault. But it was also an important building to the community in which it supported. All civic matters would have been taken here to this area. There was a lot more than just a temple there. There was a library. There were civic services there. For example, if you had a child, you would go and register it, or go and register the child's birth at the civic center. You might, if you got married, you would go and record it here. So I told you one of the important innovations that was discovered or invented and used from the time the Roman Republic begins is the barrel vault. The barrel vault is a basic construction that we still use today. It basically is a tunnel. And you can see a barrel vault in this church that we're looking at from England, I believe. So barrel vaults create a few other structures, one being the groin vault. The barrel vault is the groin vault is basically a barrel vault that intersects another barrel vault at a 90-degree angle. And then we have a hemispherical dome with an oculus. The hemispherical dome with the oculus is important because as time went on in the Roman Empire into buildings of churches and buildings that utilized domes, this technology became important. We looked at one in antiquity, we'll look at one here in the Roman Empire. So but I remember specifically talking about the Roman Republic and sculpture right before spring break. This is a sculpture of a patrician man. Patricians really needed sculpture for a few reasons. right now there is no way to record lineage through images other than sculpture. So after the Roman Empire, the technology of painting became very popular, and you could have paintings made to record lineage. When you think of today, like large estates usually have paintings of or portraits of the people who were important to the estate. This is basically their estate portrait. The estate portrait secures a recording of a line of succession in terms of money. And so in the Roman Republic, it secures a recording of a line of succession in terms of status. So because the patricians were having portraits made to prove their lineage, we see lots of sculptures with like this one, where you have a man in the center who's holding the head of his grandfather and the head of his great grandfather, I believe. This type of portrait really separates the social classes because only patricians were allowed to have this type of portrait made. We'll see plebeian portraiture in a little bit. The person that you see pictured in front of you is Marius. He's a Republican general, and he was ridiculed in the Senate for not having recorded his lineage or having ancestor statue. And so now he decided that he would get a portrait made that recorded his lineage. One of the interesting things I find in terms of portraiture and sculpture in the Roman Empire or Roman Republic is this head of an old man from Os Miso. Now, I know that doesn't seem very odd, right? He's wrinkly, he looks old, but the wrinkling is actually an over-exaggeration. They felt that this over-exaggerated, wrinkly face was something that communicated wisdom. They felt that age was valued in terms of what wisdom. The interesting thing about this, though, is that oftentimes we associate wrinkles with age, but when you look at the full sculpture, as I'm going to show you here, you end up with a really odd-looking sculpture. This over-exaggeration of age is called verism. Verism is a term that is applied only to the patrician style ancestor portraits or portraiture. Patrician style portraiture had several identifying factors, and one of those stylistic features is this verism. This head of an old man from Os Miso was a head of a senator. The head alone was enough to constitute a portrait, and it was enough to record your lineage. But the heads were often put on bodies that they really didn't seem like they belonged to. And this is a good example. If you blow this picture up, you will see that we have a portrait of a man who has a very idealized body. That body belongs on somebody who's been competing for an Olympic trophy, and a very veristic head. So you've got this really fit-looking body on this old wrinkly head, and it just doesn't seem to match. This is a portrait of a Roman general. So that was one thing I wasn't thinking about when we talked about patrician art. Patricians really have two types of portraiture. One that would be a portrait of a Roman general, and one that would be an ancestor portrait that would record lineage. The other type of art we have are for plebeians. The plebeian is the lower class of society, and the plebeians make up the larger amount of people in the Roman Republic. This type of portraiture was only for funerary purposes, and typically they were funerary portraits were commissioned by freed slaves. Slavery was a common practice in the Roman Republic. And typically, what would happen is the Roman Republic would go in and take over a new city state, bring the people back that were within the city state that they could use as resources for labor, for I don't know if the population was dwindling at that point, they would bring back women and marry them into Roman society so that they could procreate and have a good population growth. They were portraits that were typically commissioned only for funerary work, and they recorded their elevation of social status into being a freed slave. So let's look at one. This is a funerary relief with portraits of the Jesse. It is done in the plebeian style. The men on the ends, on the right and left, are plebeians. You can see that they have larger hands. They have more pronounced ears, larger noses, and bigger heads in general. The man in the center was their slave owner. He was the man who bought them and took them back to Rome, and they worked for him. So a freed slave situation would kind of go like this. You would have someone who was part of the patrician society, and he would purchase people who were coming from an incoming society or from a society that the Roman Republic was taking over. He would bring them back to his home and give them jobs to do. And as they worked, they would pay off their debt to the slave owner. Now, I'm certainly not saying that slavery in this situation was any better than what we think of it in terms of negative connotation in the United States. But it was structured a little bit differently in that the slaves could earn their freedom and oftentimes made money. Typically in the United States, we look at this as once a slave had been freed, it was a very difficult life to get back on their feet and to make businesses for themselves. That's not the case in the Roman Republic. People are bought and work off their debt and then become Roman citizens. They're not looked at as being people until they buy their freedom. Obviously something that is a despicable practice, but definitely part of the history of the plebeian people in the Roman Republic. This funerary portrait not only records the Jesse brothers purchasing their freedom, but it also records the slave owners' granting of the freedom. So it's definitely a portrait that has political. It's a document. It's a historical document, and it's an important portrait. Now it would be used for funerary purposes. So plebeians really only had one type of art, and that art would be for a funerary portrait. Bodies were buried above ground, and then the portrait that was commissioned would close up the burial chamber. In the bottom of this portrait, there's an inscription that indicates that the two men were owned by the man in the middle and paid for the monument as a gift to the owner. It was a sign of respect for the owner that granted them freedom. Here's another one of those funerary portraits. This one is called The Vegetable Vendor, And I tend to like these portraits a little bit more because they commemorate the person who they commemorate the plebeian in terms, they commemorate the plebeian's life, the accomplishments that the plebeian citizen had. Here you see a man who is selling his wares at a market. The two A-framed table horses are on each side of that long structure. The long structure is a tabletop that is flipped up parallel to the picture plane so that you can see what the vegetable vendor is selling. We call this twisted perspective or composite view. And you can see that he's selling his wares. He's got some bread there on the tabletop. He's got vegetables and he's got a basket that he would put everything in, pack it up for the end of the evening and take it home. Next day, go back to the market and set up with what he has in terms of vegetables to sell. All right, so art in the Roman Republic turns to Pompeii here in a moment. This is the Circus Maximus in Pompeii and the amphitheater in Pompeii. What you're looking at right now is a viewpoint of a bird's eye view where you're hovering over top of the two structures. So Pompeii is a typical Roman city. The civic center is the Forum. The Forum has a 2-story colonnade. There's a basilica there for administration and law, and an amphitheater that was built and created using barrel vaults. On August 24th of 79 CE, Mount Vesuvius erupts. The Pompeii was buried in 10 feet of ash in a single day. It was first explored in the 18th century, so it laid undisturbed for 1700 years. And it really told us a lot about a typical day in the life of a Roman Republic citizen. It's well known because of the dramatic story of human tragedy and death of those who lived around Pompeii, those who were community members in Pompeii. It was made poignant by the human casts that were made by early archaeologists who oversaw the research and excavation of the site. Pompeii is important historically because it had this destructive natural event that served to preserve a moment in history, a moment in history that took place over maybe a span of a couple hours. Archaeologists were able to preserve not just public and religious architecture, which is something that's more like public, a public part of life, but also to look in a window of private life in terms of just being in your home and maybe cooking dinner, or being in your home and getting the kids dressed, being in your home and conducting daily business as usual. This is a painting that was discovered in a house at Pompeii, and it documents a brawl that happened in the Roman amphitheater in 59 CE. There was a fight in the amphitheater between the Pompeians and a neighboring city, the Nicurians, during a gladiator contest. And the fight led to the closing of the amphitheater and the killing or wounding of many of the spectators. The painting includes a velarium. That's this row of canvas here at the top of the amphitheater. Sorry, it just wouldn't come to me. Okay, so this velarium is this like curtain. The curtain would have been sort of rolled down, and it provided shade from the natural elements. It provided protection from the sun. If you've ever been to a football game in the middle of a sunny day in the fall. You know what it's like to get sunburnt while sitting there watching a spectator event. It was used to protect its spectators. Events in the amphitheaters usually took a lot of time, and so those type of events tended to be ones that you would want to have some sort of protection from the natural elements as a spectator. Let's see, what else do I want to tell you about this? Also, I suppose it provided shelter from the rain as well as the sun. So this is a temple or a typical Roman house. It's sort of a real gem of Pompeii and Herculaneum. It had a private space and a public space. And so the public space was often used to conduct businesses. If you look at the reconstructed digital reconstruction of the house here, you can see different rooms. The back half of the house tended to be for private use, and the front half of the house tended to be for public use. A typical a typical businessman in Pompeii would conduct business out of the front of his home so many days a week. And then, it would be known that his day to conduct business within the community was on a certain day. So you don't go see the candlestick maker on Wednesdays because he's out buying wax and yarn for candle making. And that's sort of how things went in terms of society. They would oftentimes, their house would be a major part of their business. So here you're looking at the interior of the house in Pompeii, the House of the Vetti. The Vetti were brothers. They were they called plebeians that are people who were former slaves. They called them freedmen. They were freedmen, and they lived in Pompeii. The room that you see in the front of the house, that's what you're looking at. You're looking at the front interior room of the House of the Vetti. It has what we would look at as a skylight. It's called an impluvium. It's a basin that catches the rainwater that would have been used the rainwater would then have been used to grow crops or water the crops. If you've ever been to Italy, you know that it's a fairly humid climate. It's very Mediterranean. And so during the summer, you would probably get some condensation, but actual rainfall, it doesn't rain that often. I remember when I used to see this in undergrad, I would ask all the time, like, well, what do they do if it rains? Because if it were in Ohio, eventually our house would flood. But it's not like that there. It doesn't rain as much as it does here, and so it would have been a basin that you could collect water in, or maybe wash your feet in the rainwater or something like that. This is where most business was conducted, was in this front room of the house. Homeowners would receive business guests and do business dealings and transactions in the front of the house. Women typically were not part of the front of the house unless they were, saying when the husband would be back home. This was very much a patriarchal society. Here you see the back of the house. It has garden in it where they would have grown herbs mostly. If you think about Italy and its natural terrain, there's not a lot of growing room in terms of like tomatoes and potatoes and cucumbers, like things we see in Ohio. There's more like citrus fruit, olives, things like that. They have a fairly mountainous terrain, but also herbs and oils are something that they grow a lot. This is where the private area of the home would be. There was typically a worship room somewhere within the back part of the house. That worship space would be an opportunity for private worship. We'll get ready to see one of those cubiculums here in a minute. The back bedrooms are called cubiculums, which is basically a Roman word for a room in a house. You can see that the back has a peristyle that goes all the way around. That's all those columns that go completely around the garden. And there are several basins for catching water, storing water to water the crops. So this is wall painting, and the thing about wall painting is there are 4 different styles. Roman wall painting was something that was definitely used in ancient Rome. It was used because, once again, they were cheap. They built everything out of cement and then faux finished it, which means they plastered over it and painted it to look like a richer, more expensive material. Right here you're looking at a close-up of first style wall painting. First style wall painting is usually painting that has lots of decorative textures but doesn't have any pictures. At the top you can see the crown molding. That would have been a molding that was created by using a more expensive wooden molding and making a mold of it and then pouring plaster into it to get that decorative effect and then painting it so it looked like marble. This is the Dionysic Mystery Frieze in the second style wall painting in room 5 of the Villa of Mysteries in Pompeii. The Villa of the Mysteries was just a house that was probably belonged to someone that made a lot of money. It was a private space. It was for worship of the god Dionysus. So who's Dionysus? I always ask you. He is the party god. He's the god of wine. And so this room would have been used for worship of the god Dionysus. At the bottom, you see first style wall painting that creates sort of a ledge. The ledge, based on the way the color is represented, recedes back into space. And so using that spatial separation helps you understand what's going on in the story. In the story, they are worshiping Dionysus. You see some mythical creatures. You see women who are involved in the scene. The women would have been priestesses of the god Dionysus. Let's see. This would have been private art, meaning that the art was only intended for the people that lived in the home, not for the public. Here, this is the first scene that we have the mortals interacting with the immortal world. The illusion is to give the worshiper a connection with the immortal world. During worship in this room, women would marry the god Dionysus. We call, though, this type of wall painting second style. Anything that has imagery in it is called second style wall painting. Now, I won't ask you to be able to differentiate between all 4 different styles, because we'll study first, second, third, and fourth. But I do want you to know the difference between first and second. In second style wall painting, you tend to get an illusion of a 3-dimensional space. As I explained, the first style wall painting is at the bottom, and then there's an illusion of space and depth because of the way the painting recedes, or the ledge recedes into the painting. The Villa of the Mysteries is also interesting because of its iconography, or because of the clues that tell us who the person is in the painting. Many believe that this room was used to celebrate in private the mysteries of the Greek god of Dionysus, and I imagine that could have been any kind of private worship. It was could have been sexual. It's hard to say. Um, there was an official cult of Dionysus among women at this time. There were female immortals that interact with the mythological figures, perhaps representing an initiation rite. Um, in some, the young woman would have emulated Eridyne, who was the daughter of King Minos, who was united in marriage with Dionysus. In this next PowerPoint slide, you see a cubiculum that was taken from ancient Rome at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The scene on the left is what the cubiculum typically looked like. Now, what you're looking at here, you can see it only has one window. And so oftentimes the second style wall paintings that decorated the cubiculums were paintings that were a reflection of the outside world, because women did not go out all that much. But here you have outdoor decoration, so it feels like a connection to the outside world. And then on the right, you see this beautiful persimmon color paired with this gold that was common in Pompeii. It is a stylistic feature of second style wall painting in Pompeii specifically. Once again, you get that recession into space that you see with the ledge that recedes. There's this architectural framework to the image on the right in which they create a environment for a small area to worship. This is a gardenscape from the second style wall painting from the Villa of Livia in Prima Porta, Italy. It was painted around 30 to 20 BCE. It is a fresco. It is 6 feet 7 inches high, and it is buon fresco, true fresco. It's illusionistic as well. It was really made for feeling connected to the outdoor world. You see a lot of naturalism here, with no representation of people at all. It is the Villa of Livia, who was the Emperor Augustus's wife. It has atmospheric perspective because you get this fence that comes close to the picture plane, and as it recedes into space, there is another fence that sort of fences off the major part of vegetation there. Garden spaces were common motifs in these type of second style wall paintings. Here's a full panned out view of the gardens. This is third style wall painting. There's an emphasis on the wall surface. It's very linear. If you see wall painting that has these thin little spindly lines with an architectural framework, it's usually third style. There are typically floating small vignettes that the thin architecture frames, and there's a flat colored background. This is fourth style wall painting, and fourth style wall painting combines elements of second and third all together. But they're really not realistic or sort of irrational fantasy. There's no sky beyond the decoration. It's ornamental and somewhat gallery-like in the idea that it creates this architectural framework for a still life painting that goes in the center of the wall. Here's another view of that fourth style wall painting where you get the combination of the second style and the third style. You can see the painting to the right is imagery of people. At the bottom, you have some first style wall painting trying to create some depth within the image. One of the things that fourth style wall painting provides is an opportunity for still life paintings to appear on the wall. This is the very first still life ever in the history of art. It is a still life of peaches, and it's a wall fresco. It's bone fresco. The thing that's pretty amazing about this is that bone fresco is a difficult medium to get good detail out of. And here you can see that the artist very skillfully was able to paint a small vase. The vase is clear and see-through, and it's filled with water. And so that the trying to capture how the vase looks with water in it, it's translucent and clear. Trying to create that surface is very difficult, even with modern day art tools like oil paint. And back then, they were doing this in fresco. So to be able to get that kind of texture variation was something that was definitely took a lot of skill. Another important thing that comes out of Italy at this time are these fresco paintings that are images of people. These fresco paintings have some iconography in them that indicate what the people did in life. We know that they were upper class citizens because they both have tools in their hands for writing. You can see the man is gripping a scroll, and she's gripping a stylus, which means that they both could read and write. These paintings are actually frescoes. You can see that they have some stylistic features of Mediterranean art at this time, with the prominent brow ridge and the wide-set almond-shaped eyes. We get more variation in the skin tone and the details of the face. But for the most part, you get this nice three-dimensional feel to the face, and you get a good sense of texture variation in the clothing. These portraits were common in Egypt as well. They were called Fayum portraits, and they were made of a different material called encaustic. Encaustic material is more like a wax. The closest thing I can tell you that we have today like it would be crayons, but the wax encaustic portraits would be put over top of a mummy, and it would be a death mask to represent who the mummy belonged to. All right, so we are moving on to, well, let me see here. Yes, we are getting ready to move into the Roman Empire. So as we transition into the Roman Empire, I will tell you when it is time to make an official transition. But as we move into the Roman Empire, we have some goals for you. Here, it's to understand the great innovations of Roman architecture and how these innovations contributed to the expanse of the Roman Empire. To explore Pompeii for its information about Roman art and architecture, which we've done. Examine the types, methods, and subject matter of Roman wall painting. We did that. Understand what Roman portraiture says about Roman society. We did that. We talked about the plebeian portraiture versus the patrician portraiture. Understand the political nature of the Roman art and architecture, especially as it communicates ideas for power for the emperor and the empire. That is coming up. And we're going to examine changes in Roman art and architecture as a result of expansion from the Roman Empire and incorporation of the conquered cultures. So we're going to see that in the next set of slides for the Roman Empire. So I'm bringing this line of succession up again because we are getting ready to change hands in terms of power. And I just kind of want to give you an overview of how Roman art unfolds and how it relates to the line of succession. So the Republic ends with the title of Augustus being bestowed on Octavian. We talked about him. He's the grandnephew of Julius Caesar, remembering that Augustus is a title just like President Trump. As you go through the line of succession, emperors who are pretty famous come along, like Caligula, Nero, Vespasian, Titus, then Domitian, Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, Diocletian, and Constantine. I would say things start to really pick up when we look at Trajan and Hadrian, and they move forward into the art that Constantine has as they change from being the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire. We see a nice span of peace. That time is called the Pax Romana. All right, so here's a map during the height of the empire's control. You can see that Rome has control of all of Britain, all of Spain, Italy, France, Turkey, Germany, most of the Middle East, and the northern parts of Africa, including Egypt and the northern tip of Africa. This northern area of Africa, I happened to mention earlier that it is very important. One of the most important ports that there was in the Roman Empire is Carthage. Carthage is going to be a hot seat for probably the next 2 or 3 lectures. It is a place in which the port city controlled trade, and that particular port was very important to the people of the Roman Empire, because whoever controlled Carthage had the ability to control trade into Africa, trade to the east, and trade to the west. Trade to the north was easy because there are lots of port cities that line the north part of the Mediterranean Sea. But the cities that line the Mediterranean Seas to the south are Carthage, Alexandria. Carthage and Alexandria were 2 of the most important ports in all of the Roman Empire. And so we're going to see that the emperors vehemently fight for them and defend them to keep control over trade. So this is the portrait of Augustus as general from Prima Porta, Italy. It is 1st century CE. It is a copy of a bronze original that was made in 20 BCE. It is about 7 feet high, and it is in the Vatican Museum in Rome today. So here's Emperor Augustus. This is Augustus Octavian. He stands addressing the people, so that raised right hand is what we call the orator pose. It's just the pose that they took whenever they were busy speaking. He stands sort of lifelike in that he's got all of his weight on the first foot. He has some weight lifted off of the back foot, and he stands firmly on that platform. You can see that he's dressed in general type attire. His breastplate has very specific images from his military accomplishments. Underneath that breastplate is a dress, for lack of a better term, tunic, I guess would be a better term, that is made of leather. That tunic keeps the body protected, and then underneath that is a lighter weight garment that's made of a type of material. You can see that the old toga robes that they wore in the Republic have now been wrapped around the center of the waist. Those toga robes are social status symbols, and so getting rid of the robe altogether is something that they're not ready to do yet. You can see that they still haven't completely liberated that statue from the block of stone, because you still have the the strut there at the bottom left-hand side of Augustus. And it has a little putti at the bottom. He reaches up to grab the hem of Augustus's skirt. So the big difference here in terms of portraiture is that we went from patrician portraiture having verism to patrician portraiture being idealized. This is an idealized image of Augustus. Something interesting to know about portraiture has to do with the way they represent the political figure in different areas of the empire. So if the portrait was commissioned for an area in Germany, it would have more German-like features. The portrait's face would. If it was commissioned for an area like Egypt, it would have features. Augustus would have features that were a little bit thinner, had more elongation in the face, that are stereotypically features that you would see of people in that population. It's important because what you're looking at is if you put 10 portraits of Augustus together, they all look like Augustus, but they all have variations that help the people in the community see their race of people in the portrait. It's important because the community needs to be able to see that the emperor they need to be able to relate to the portrait of the emperor. Remember, there's no photography at this time, so the only way they have any connection with the emperor is to see a stone carving of him. For the average plebeian, the only thing they really know about the emperor is the local government and how it interacts with the emperor. Okay, so a little interesting Roman trivia. Who's the earliest dictator of the Roman Republic? It is Julius Caesar. What was the name of the famous day that Caesar was murdered? It is March 44th BCE. We call this day that he was murdered the Ides of March. We say beware of the Ides of March. His death began a civil war in the Roman world, and the war lasts for 15 years. I think the Ides of March takes place on March 14th. I usually have a student that knows in the audience, so stop and take a gander for me. Was it March 14th? I think it was. During this time, Octavian takes over, defending for Caesar, and fights the opposing forces led by Mark Antony. Mark Antony is married to Cleopatra, who is the queen of Egypt under Roman rule. And in 30 BCE, Cleopatra and Mark Antony know that they are outnumbered and that they are losing the battle, and so they admirably commit suicide together. That was something that was common back then. It was much more admirable to commit suicide than be captured by the opposing forces and tortured for information. The Roman Senate at this point declares Octavian the new emperor in 27 BCE, and he becomes known as Augustus. Rome is now the Roman Empire. So from the portrait of Augustus forward, you are looking at art from the Roman Empire, not the Roman Republic. In 12 BCE, Augustus decides that he wants to have a Pontiff Maximus. The Pontiff Maximus is a Latin word meaning chief priest of the high state religion. So he wanted to make everyone look to him for religious leadership. Why do you think this was really necessary? Well, we go back to the Roman Empire was made of many, many cultures. Remember, the empire spans over a vast amount of land, and because of that, there are a vast amount of cultures. I think you could probably compare it to a modern-day United States in the amount of different cultures that are seen within the empire. And the social class system was somewhat similar in that you have a group of people who tend to be more focused upon as being the elite group of people. Those people are people who are the main controllers of the state, and then minority populations that they've brought into their area due to people conquering. All right, so I was in the middle of telling you a bunch of different facts. Julius Caesar was declared a god when he was murdered, and therefore Augustus declares himself the son of God. Is that ironic to you? What do you think was going on in the Christian world at this time? Augustus brings peace and prosperity to the Mediterranean, and during that time, we call that peace and prosperity era the Pax Romana. A new style of art emerges. Verism goes away completely, and we trade it for idealism. This is Livia. She is Augustus's wife. She's an imperial woman for the Augustan age. She is the ideal, quintessential, beautiful woman. She represents youth. She represents idealized beauty. Her face, while looking very European in its width, she has fairly high cheekbones. She's very pointy chin, smaller lips, and a little bit more elongated nose with those big, huge, wide-set eyes. This portrait was one that was for Egypt, and so, of course, her face will take on some more Middle Eastern type traits. This is the Areopagus. It is a monument that was created by Augustus. It was given to his wife Livia as a birthday present in 9 BCE. The monument celebrates his most significant achievement, which is the establishment of peace in the Roman Empire for a long period of time, called the Pax Romana. You can see that it's made of marble, and it has a box-like structure or cube-like structure that has relief carvings on all four sides of the building, as well as in the interior of the monument. The interior of the monument has a Corinthian swag that decorates the entire inner cube of the structure. There are mythological scenes that are on the outside of the cube that are scenes of sacrifice. It was propaganda for Augustus to the Roman world. There are many mythological panels on it. Let's go to the next slide, and I will show you some of the panels up close. Before I do that, though, I want to tell you a little bit about these Delve Deeper activities. If you click on the blue link, it will take you to a virtual tour of the Areopagus. In the next slide, we see an article that I've found for you about the Areopagus. You're required to do 2 Delve Deeper activities per unit, and these Delve Deeper activities allow you to get a more in-depth understanding of specific works of art. So this is one of the frieze panels on the... This next relief that we look at is on the side of the Pax Romana monument, and it is the procession of the imperial family. It's a detail in the south frieze of the Areopagus. The procession was sculpted as a homage to the processional that you see on the Parthenon in Greece. It has some different agenda to it, but it definitely was inspired by the Pantheonic procession to honor Athena on the Parthenon's frieze. Um, the one that the Italians do is different than the Greek one because the Greek model represents an important procession to honor the goddess Athena that happens as a ritual every 4 years over and over again. Here in the Roman uh, processional that is depicted on the Areopagus, the processional is also propaganda to carry out a political and social agenda that Augustus has. Augustus is concerned about the decline in birth rate among the Roman nobility, and so he enacts a series of laws that promote marriage, marital fidelity, and raising children. So you see lots of images of men, women, and children as a moral example to what it is that Augustus wants. Um, we think that this particular work of art depicts a specific inaugural event when the altar was begun. We have recognizable people within the community in the frieze, as well as a good mixture of men, women, and children. So this is the famous Pont du Gard in Nimes, France. The Pont du Gard is a major innovation of the Roman Empire. When we think of Roman Empire, you think of the aqueducts, you think of the Colosseum. This aqueduct system was something that was born out of that barrel vault technology. It was built to create a waterway channel from the mountains into the city. As the Roman Empire got stronger and stronger, their investment in infrastructure got stronger and stronger. So, an investment in roads and bridges and things like that got more committed. Why? As they got stronger, trade got stronger, and so it was in their best interest to build more infrastructure so that they could get needed supplies to the entire area, especially in places in France that would be more like countryside, because if you've got some sort of invasion or something that you're fighting, taking over your areas, you need to be able to get things like water easily to your troops. And so sometimes with infrastructure, well, most of the time, the infrastructure was politically and economically a good move for the empire. The aqueduct system is a marvel because it is this continuous row of barrel vaults, and it uses gravity to carry water from the mountains into the city. You can see that it creates this interesting architectural barrier between one part of the land and another part of the land. But instead of making it a solid wall, they use that barrel vault to open the channel up so that you could see through the wall, through the barrel vaults to the other side of the natural terrain. And so it creates this even more aesthetically pleasing way to bring water into the city. I mean, think about our current modern day water treatment facilities. They're not beautiful. Of course, they're underground, so nobody can see them. But they certainly are not a artistic and architectural marvel of our day and age. The aqueduct carries about 100 gallons of water a day for each source that it goes to in the city. It carries it for about 30 miles. Water flows from the mountains, and gravity, the way the aqueduct is shaped, is what carries the water into the city. This one has a total of 3 stories, and it is built on top of the Gard River. So because of it straddling the Gar River, it was named the Pont du Gard. Um, each large arch spans 82 feet and consists of blocks weighing up to 2 tons each. The bridge's uppermost level is a row of smaller arches. Um, there are 3 stories total. There's a ratio of smaller arches to the larger arches, and it means that the hydraulic engineers who designed the aqueduct bridge also had a keen set on aesthetics. And so you can get a mathematical formula out of the visual repetition that you see in front of you for the aqueduct. This is another one of the aqueduct sites. It's carrying water through the Porta Maggiore in Rome, but you can see that it looks very different. It has to accommodate the street traffic, and so it just has a different feeling to it. It has a double gateway. It supports 2 water channels instead of 3. It is where a tributary happens, where the water all comes together from 2 separate sources. It has an attic, which is the uppermost story. That part's important because we're going to see other attics from other arches. So those are coming up. There are inscriptions that conceal the meeting of the 2 waterways. And this is what we call ashlar masonry. It's stone that is at the bottom very rough, and as it goes up to the top becomes smooth. The stone being at the bottom and the top being smooth is a contrast in which the ideas and values of the people are put into place. And I know that sounds a little weird. We're talking about bricks, right? But the idea was, as you are at the bottom, closer to Earth, you are not as well refined as you've lived your years on Earth and have gotten closer to the gods. So, art from the Roman. The Colosseum is probably one of the most famous buildings in all of the world. And I will tell you all these great little details about it here in a minute, but I want to tell you some history first. So in 19 BCE, Augustus Octavian dies. And when he passes away, the next family that comes into power is not that strong of a family in terms of political power. And so many families come in and out of political power. But finally, one of the families that takes over is a little bit stronger, and they're called the Flavians. The Flavian family ruled Rome for about 25 years, and the Colosseum was built by the Flavians. The land that it was built on was Nero's land. Nero had a golden house. That is one of the Delve Deeper activities in this PowerPoint presentation. So I highly encourage you to learn more about Nero's golden house. The new emperor that takes over is responsible for a building initiative. Like I said, they build on top of Nero's golden house, and they build this Colosseum. The Colosseum houses the Roman gladiators. It holds about 50,000 people. And it's constructed out of those repeating barrel vaults. Now, there are 3 different orders that the barrel vaults or the architecture takes on. It's 16 stories high, and I'm sorry, there are four different orders in the bands. First is Tuscan, then Ionic, then Corinthian. And the very top has engaged Corinthian columns. The Colosseum was a really fascinating and interesting place. It was a place that mostly men went to. Women could attend, but not. It was not common. It had a velarium, just like the amphitheater in Pompeii. And here, what you're looking at is a wooden bridge that was built over top of the existing ruin structure. But at one time, the entire floor that you see here was built out of wood planking. It went over top of the cages below. The cages held animals like tigers, and the gladiators would be housed down there until it was their time to come up and entertain the crowd by fighting. The wooden bridge that's built there is to allow spectators to walk across and see what the ruins look like underneath. At one time, there were marble seats, but they have been taken out since, and as the seats have been carried away for the use of art and using the marble for material. In the Middle Ages, they needed those kind of resources. You can see the Colosseums got some sense of versatility to it in terms of the type of battles they would have here. Sometimes they would flood the entire Colosseum to have reenactments of naval battles in the arena. They also had several trapdoors where they would pay someone between fights to come on deck and clean up the arena's flooring because it would get dirty and gross from the battles that took place for entertainment. This is a portrait bust of a Flavian woman. It's something that Gardner includes in the textbook, and I think it's a really important part of the Roman history. It shows how the sense of ideal beauty changes over a period of time. When the Flavians take over, the ideal beauty that is popular at the time is this coveted diamond-shaped face. We have a lot of Flavian portraiture in general, and this one was probably a Flavian princess. The hair is piled high on the head, and so it was long, but then put up on top of the head in this coiffure as the ideal beautiful hairstyle at the time. The neck being elongated is looked at as beautiful, and then you see the diamond-shaped face that's highly coveted even today. When you look at her hair that's all piled on the top of her head, I think the elongation of the neck may have come about as a necessary detail of beauty to offset the height of the hair. In this case, we only have a bust. You get the neckline and the collarbone of the female, but it's this very delicate looking contrast between the hair and the skin. All right, so now we're moving on to High Empire art. After the Flavians come in and out of power, we have some new historical things that happen. Before we move on to Trajan, I'll just tell you some basic overview of the events of the High Empire. Trajan enlarges the empire, and then he builds a forum with a temple, a basilica, an equestrian portrait, and a market nearby. There's a column that is dedicated to Trajan's victories, his military accomplishments, and then there's a nude sculpture that sits at the top of the spiral narrative, at the top of the column. We see many monuments honoring Roman military power. And so that would be the main difference between early empire and high empire. Is the early empire, the monuments focused on infrastructure and making the emperor look good. As we get into the high empire, they reveal a sense of accomplishment within the military, and they celebrate the military accomplishments more so than Augustus's propaganda art. This is propaganda art too, but it's propaganda art about more than one central figure. This is the Arch of Titus. It is in Rome, Italy, and it was done in 81 CE. Titus dies in 81 BCE, and his brother, who is Domitian, dedicates a triumphal arch in Titus's honor. The triumphal arch is something that we see that the Roman Empire's artists built all over the Roman Empire. There are a couple interesting vocabulary words that go with these triumphal arches. For one, the road that goes underneath the arch is called the Sacred Way. They use a barrel vault, and this is a pretty hefty monument. It's deep enough that there are relief sculptures on the interior walls of the triumphal arch. At the top, you see the attic, just like we talked about in the aqueduct. The attic is this area at the top that has Roman lettering and inscription in Latin that says something about the honor of whoever it was dedicated to. In this case, it is a saying that honors Domitian. On the exterior, oftentimes there was propaganda art that gave props to the emperor. In the interior, usually there was some sort of relief sculpture that spoke of military prowess. They would oftentimes make a big show out of moving underneath the triumphal arch. It was a symbolic way of honoring something big that happened within the empire. Oftentimes, a military troop would march down the Sacred Way to another destination, and it signified it was propaganda for power within the military. It just made the military look good. By definition, a triumphal arch is a freestanding arch that has a long grounding in Roman history. The Arch of Titus has engaged columns on each side and composite capitals, which means it has capitals that have more than one order to them. In this case, I think they're Ionic and Corinthian. The Senate is the one that ultimately approves the building of the memorial to honor Titus, who dies and becomes a god when he dies. He is the son of Vespasian. There are spandrels that decorate the far sides of the Arch of Titus on the exterior walls, and they are personifications of victory. The interior panels commemorate the conquest of Judea. They represent the spoils that were brought back from Jerusalem during the Roman Empire. Spoils are much like a triumphal parade that go down the sacred way, but these type of parades carry back bounty from the area that they conquered. The Sacred Way was built at the end of the Jewish Wars in 70 CE. The troop that are marching back into Rome with victorious booty as well as captives, you can see are walking with a large candelabra, various steles, and a musical instrument. The sculpture has a sense of movement to it. It comes out of the diagonal lines that are created where the men are walking. You get the idea that they're walking uphill or they're walking very aggressively. They also look as if it must take some great strength to walk with as much motion as they have. The other thing that alludes to the motion is the candelabra that they're carrying is slightly tipped backwards, as well as all of the stele flags. It is very high relief. In other words, if I were to reach out and touch the arm of the man who's walking uphill that comes closest towards the picture plane, my hand would be able to wrap completely around his arm and not be touching the back of the relief panel. It has a feeling of fast moving because of the deep cuts into the relief and how far out the military group projects from the interior of the sacred wall. It's been heavily damaged, and we don't have some of the important information that tells us more about the interior. I would say it probably has been damaged from war coming into Rome. This is the opposite panel in the Arch of Titus. So the one we just got done looking at was on one side, and this one is on the other side. It is a portrait of Titus driving a triumphal chariot. It has some allegorical figures, which are part of this overall story. An allegorical figure is a personification of a concept. So in Greece, we looked at the Nike as the personification of victory. Here we're looking at the personifications of honor and valor. Honor is the bare-chested figure that you see leading the horses. Oh, I'm sorry, I always get this mixed up. Valor is the girl that leads the horses. Honor sits right behind Titus in the chariot. Oh, I'm sorry. Victory rides with Titus. And let me see. We need a bare-chested figure to... Oh, right here. See, the personification of honor is right here underneath the chariot. This is a celebration of imperial values. It's the first known instance of divine beings interact with humans in a relief sculpture. We saw it in the fresco painting at the Villa of the Mysteries in Pompeii. Now we're seeing it here again in the relief sculpture. And it becomes a new hallmark of the High Empire. It doesn't have quite as much movement as the one on the opposite side, but you do see movement within the horse picking up its hooves. Very beautiful representation of the musculature of the horse, as well as the musculature of honor, standing right next to the chariot. So in the High Empire, we see a focus on monuments that are grandiose and made of marble, and immortals being pictured in the mortal world, and vice versa. The empire's leadership really is unchanging. We get a lot of power from the line of the Flavians. Domitian ends up being a lot like Nero as an emperor, and he's assassinated in 96 CE. If you remember right, Nero is the emperor who he kind of had a sadistic sense of humor. He once lights a fire in the main street of Rome that he lives on, and he stands back and watches the city start burning, and the fire burns for many days. And then when the fire's over, remember, he was the one that started the fire in the first place. When the fire's over, he says, hey, I think I'll make a new law that says that houses have to be built so far apart, further apart than they were before, so that the entire row doesn't catch on fire. And then he makes a law to widen the streets, so if a building catches on fire, they can more easily recover from it. Of course, he's the one that set the problem in the first place, and then he went back and fixed it to look like he had power over that. And then he decides he's going to build his golden house, which I'll let you investigate a little bit more on your own in the delve deeper activities. The Senate chooses Nerva to follow Domitian as the emperor, and then Nerva rules for about 16 months. But a new important pattern in the succession of emperors begins, and that is that Nerva establishes this idea that he gets to select his own successor. And so he did this before he dies, and he chooses Trajan as his successor. Trajan was a really popular Roman general. He was the first non-Italian ever to rule Rome. He was Spanish. Trajan had a very strong imperial army. He spread the empire as large as it was ever. So at the height of the empire, he was ruling, and he expands the empire in terms of land through military gain. And he was popular emperor. He had a heavy building initiative and supported the arts in the empire. So in terms of building projects, he remodels the Circus Maximus, that famous area for chariot racing. He puts in a new bath complex over top of Nero's Golden House. And then there's a new forum that is built by his chief engineer, whose name was Apollodorus of Damascus. Right now, what you're looking at are the ruins of the ruins of the Forum of Trajan. If we're looking at the ruins today, we can see some interesting things in the footprint. So for one thing, if you see this red sort of ellipse-shaped object over here on the left, that is the Basilica Ulpia. Trajan's family name was Ulpia, and so he built a basilica dedicated to his family. The basilica was a civic forum that was created to house political events, rallies, people discussing things. You see the Flavian Amphitheater. This is Colosseum, and then the Circus Maximus here up towards the front of the picture plane, or the front of the footprint. This big red blob here, that's the Basilica Olpia. I think the most interesting thing about the Basilica Olpia is that it is the beginning of the tradition of building basilicas. The basilica plan is one that was commonly used and is still used commonly today. Many churches are built based on this plan. The Forum of Trajan itself was a massive building. Number 4 is the Basilica Olpia, but as you enter in through the courtyard, you would encounter an equestrian statue. That's number 6. As you keep going, you encounter the nave, and as you enter, you will see the basilica and its interior. As you keep going, you'll see the Column of Trajan, and then behind that, the temple that was built to honor. I'm not sure who it specifically honored, but it was built to honor some god or goddess. Trajan rules from 98 to 117 CE. He was appointed to power by the Senate. During Trajan's rule, the Senate is in full power and the Roman Empire is at the height of its success. There were many government programs to benefit the people, and that's part of why they felt that Trajan was such a good emperor. This commission of the Forum was part of Trajan's large building initiative. Entry through the Forum comes from this large gateway here. It's 400 feet long by 200 feet wide, and it has the very first clerestory. I'll show you that in the next slide. Inside the building was a library, a complex marketplace. The building was paid for by the spoils of the Dacian Wars. Those people were defeated. The people that were defeated in the Dacian Wars are the people of modern-day Romania. The basilica was the main focus in the Forum. It's very large and ornate. It had apses on each side of the short ends. The entrance is along the long side, and it's 400 feet long by 200 feet wide. Here's an interior reconstruction of the interior of the Forum of Trajan. Note the marble patterned floor that is so beautifully polished and highly reflective. It had a coffered timber ceiling. A coffer is this recess in the top of the ceiling. We see sunken panels that have decoration. There are 2 levels to the building, 2 stories, and a peristyle that supports the building all the way around. In the top level, you get a single side aisle, and then the area above the fencing here is called a clerestory. A clerestory is a way to allow natural light to come into the building. The very first clerestory that we ever discussed was the one in ancient Egypt. This is the second. In the bottom level, or the very first story, you get a double side aisle. You can see that the building was one of those really, really large buildings, just like we talked about the churches in Europe. They're just enormous. They're buildings that when you go into the building, you almost feel as if you're outside, just like you would in a big, huge warehouse. You get this sense of space that's so distorted. Uh, be ready as we get moving into the churches, into the Christian Basilica churches, to be able to compare the Basilica Oppia with the new Christian churches. This is a shot of the interior of the ruins of the Basilica Oppia. Oh, I'm sorry. No, this is a shot of the Great Hall in the Markets of Trajan, which was another part of his building initiative. You do see that iron fencing at the top where the clerestory is, though. So I mentioned that when you enter the Forum of Trajan, you eventually come to the Column of Trajan. The Column of Trajan was also engineered by Apollodorus of Damascus. This particular pole contains a spiral narrative that was invented specifically for this monument. It's 128 feet high, and it at one time had a heroic statue of the emperor at the top. I believe it was a heroic nude. The band is 620 feet total. It depicts 2 successful campaigns against the Dacians, and it increases in width as it winds up to the top of the column. There are 150 episodes in the narrative. There are 2,500 figures in the relief. The column celebrates 150 episodes of the Dacian wars, which were major victories for Trajan. At one time, it was thought that the spiral narrative was an actual recount of events that happened in the Dacian Wars, but as time has gone on, they've found out that that is not true. It is not a historical depiction, rather a nostalgic depiction. There are images of Trajan addressing his troops, him sacrificing to the gods, and him doing other things that benefited the empire. Let's see. It was originally painted, and it included a lot of battle scenes, but not they had easy to read vignettes. As you get to the top, the banding gets wider and wider so that you can make sense of what you're looking at from the ground, because it is so very tall. In addition to the banding at the top, has more simple images so that they can be seen from the ground. The column and the entire forum was paid for by the spoils of the Dacian Wars. This is a Delve Deeper activity. You can follow the link to a National Geographic article. It does ask you to make an email account, so note that. It was a really fascinating article. This is the portrait bust of Hadrian. So this is Hadrian's Pantheon in Rome. The Pantheon was a temple that was built to all of the Roman gods. It's one of the best preserved buildings from antiquity, and it reveals the potential of concrete as a medium altogether. Originally, there was a courtyard in the front of the building, just like we saw in the Forum of Trajan. But as the building was, or as the city got older and the building was too cumbersome in terms of size and space to have the forum attached to it. So they lost the forum due to space. But here you can see what stands of the building. It reveals the potential of concrete as a medium because they adjust what they call the basalt content. Basalt was a material that made the cement heavy, and so by changing the basalt ratio in the tufa as they went upward in the building process, it allowed the top part of the building to be more lightweight. Why was it important that the ceiling be lighter? Well, because this building is a Tholos building. It has a 360-degree sphere that fits inside that hemispherical dome with oculus. The Pantheon is a temple to all of the gods, and Hadrian built it to honor the gods, but also as a civic place, a civic forum. If you remember, I told you that Hadrian loved Greek architecture, and so what he's done here is he's brought back an architectural element from ancient Greece. If you remember in the lecture about prehistoric Greece, they had a Tholos tomb. It was the treasury of Arcturus, and so they found various artifacts buried in the treasury of Arcturus. And so Hadrian, because he likes ancient Greek architecture so much, he incorporates something that is very much rooted in Greek innovation, and that was the Tholos temple. The top of it has an oculus. It's an area that would have let natural light into the building. It's another answer to the Claire story, only it only allows light in one place. This is an exterior. Oop, let's go back. Oh, this is an interior view of the Parthenon. Or, I'm sorry, the Pantheon. You can see, this is a 17th century drawing of the Pantheon. But you can see in the illustration what the interior of the Pantheon looked like. At one point in time, the coffers adorned gold brass stars. Those stars were actually taken out of the Pantheon during the Renaissance or Baroque time period and melted down to make a structure in the Vatican. The Vatican didn't care because he felt that they were presenting triumph over polytheism. But at this time, Hadrian created a temple to all the gods that had these beautiful stars in the center of the coffers. And they were supposed to make you feel somewhat transformed to a more intimate relationship with the gods. The coffers allow the ceiling to be less weighty because some of the mass is taken out of the some of the heaviness is taken out of the ceiling because there's less material. The oculus is the name for the hole there at the top. At the floor, you see that art statuary was a feature of this building because of the niches that you see the statues in. It was originally built as a forum for law matters and civic things, but as time went on, they used it for additional religious things as well. So Hadrian adopts Antonius, who in turn adopts Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, in terms of line of succession for emperor. Hadrian does this to assure a peaceful line of succession to the empire, creating peace for a whole new generation. Hadrian dies, and the Senate proclaims Hadrian a god, and Antonius takes the imperial throne. Antonius rules for 23 years, and then he dies, and Marcus Aurelius and Lucius take over. Marcus Aurelius and Lucius build a memorial column to honor Antonius. You see Antonius and his empress, they're depicted in the heavens. You can see them here. This is a decurios. Oh, and that's a ritual that depicts the circling of the imperial pyre, or the fire of the body for the firing of the body for cremation. All the figures are in a classical style. And then on the back, you can see the actual group of figures that represent the figures circling the cremation ritual. The artist takes a departure from the classical depiction of the figures and creates a stockier, wider depiction of the figures. If you remember right, if we go all the way back to the beginning of this lecture when we talked about the Roman Republic, you see that we have a new style of art emerging, a throwback to the plebeian style that we had seen before. Being in the plebeian class versus the patrician class really had nothing to do with money and wealth. While patricians tended to have more money, sometimes patricians could be poor and plebeians could be wealthy. We are seeing this new style come about because at this point it's 161 CE. We know that Jesus died at 30 CE, and so we're starting to get enough space between the death of Jesus and the establishment of Christianity as a religion. We're starting to get enough space between that we're going to start seeing the religion aspect come more and more into portraiture. This is the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius. It's from Rome, Italy. It was done in 175 CE. It's made of bronze. It's 11 foot 6 inches, and it's in the Capitolini Palazzo dei Conservatori in Rome. It is this larger-than-life size gilded bronze statue of Marcus Aurelius. His arm is stretched out to offer a greeting to viewers. We once thought that this was a portrait of Constantine, but because most ancient bronze statues were melted down for their metal, like I told you, they tried to melt down anything they could get their hands on in Rome to create structures for the Vatican. Because the Christians regarded the structures of antiquity as polytheism and paganism, they really felt that the history of the image or the history of the art did not need to be respected. Here you see a close-up of Marcus Aurelius on his horse. The fact that the statue was so large, it's larger than life-size gilded bronze, and I believe this is the very first one of these life-size statues that we've studied, but regardless, the Size of the statue is impressive in terms of skill. These large bronze statues are difficult to create, but also you can see the high level of attention to detail and realism in the statue. There's a new set of ideal beauty. Men are wearing their hair a little bit longer. In the beginning of the early empire, we saw hair cropped very closely to the head. And what I think you'll see more so as we keep going is how the ideal beauty starts to incorporate groups of people who are considered somewhat threatening to the empire. So they typically regarded people who lived to the north as being more barbaric like, with longer hair, and they felt that the closely coiffed hair that was short was more Roman, more responsible, more clean cut. But as they are being sort of squeezed by the populations in the north, in terms of land size and invasion, they seem to take on some more of those traits and features of the people in the north. This is the portrait bust of Caracalla. After Augustus dies, Roman power begins to erode. Hadrian was a good and prosperous emperor, but he was the only emperor that carried the empire further. The empire is now being threatened by its size and by European Vandals and the Turks. We see this in the face of Caracalla. You can see he has this very furrowed brow. It looks off to the side. It doesn't look directly at you. He's bare-chested, donning some sense of military power. This is the sarcophagus with the myth of the Orestes. Lines of succession move to Diocletian, but there really isn't any other notable emperor that we see until we get to Constantine. You can sort of see the influx and control being threatened in the sculpture. You see these heroic dudes doing you see mythological creatures, mermaids mostly, that the mythological people are battling so that they can carry the soul to the afterlife. As we get further and further into the late empire, we see a sarcophagus with portraiture that now is beginning to start to show these plebeian traits of the large heads and the large hands with the squatty bodies. Why do we think that the large heads and large hands and squatty bodies are going to be becoming a norm? Because of Christianity. Christianity is threatening the empire. The Romans are having a lot of trouble with it. And so we see that the sarcophagus dons plebeian looking art. This is the mummy portrait of a priest from the Fayum. It's encaustic, and we talked about this whenever I showed you the portraits a little bit earlier of the husband and wife. This is a death portrait. It's a mummy portrait. It would have been placed over the mummy instead of one of those fancy helmets that were put on these the fancy like death masks like we saw for King Tut. Encaustic is a type of material that's waxy. It's sort of like painting with a crayon. And most places or most parts of the empire that mummified still utilize these type of portraits on the outside of the mummies. Here's one of the portraits being shown now with the portrait being on the mummy. You can see that the mummification wraps are painted and that the portrait takes place of the face. This is the four tetrarchs. The four tetrarchs are often portrayed together. They are a group of families that are in power in Constantinople, in Turkey. Really, they, at this point, are starting to feel the loss of the grip of the empire. The empire is growing weak. It's not able to keep good, strong leadership for a long period of time. And because of that, you see leaders who are terrified. They're terrified because the plebeians are starting to realize that they outnumber the patricians. The patricians at this point were the only people that had religion, and the plebeians are feeling like they would like to be able to have their own religion as well. This is a restored cutaway of the Basilica Novia. The Basilica Novia was dedicated to Constantine, and it was created in Rome, Italy from 306 to 312. It no longer stands. This is a digital recreation of the building. But the building was very, very large. The statue that sits at the end, the statue that is a man dressed in golden robes, is a statue of Constantine. We are continuing to see stylistic carryovers from the Roman Empire into Christianity. Constantine does not declare himself a Christian until later on in life, closer to the time that he dies. They have a meeting because they are at the point where they can't defend the empire any longer in terms of polytheism. And so Constantine decides that they outnumber him, and so he can't beat them, so he's just going to join them, and he declares himself a Christian and that the official state religion should be Christian. Here is a portrait of Constantine. It is a colossal portrait. The head alone is 8 feet tall. That's just the head. We still have, I think, one of the hands and one of the legs that belong to this statue, but the statue alone was over 65 feet high. So now we're into art from the late Empire, and here you see the Arch of Constantine. The triumphal arches are still being used for emperors' victories. We see that it's still a way that the late Empire creates propaganda. There are relief sculptures from other monuments that are taken off of the other monuments and put onto this monument. Oftentimes they'll take the relief sculpture that honors a different emperor, chisel the face off of it, and add a new face to the new emperor who took over. The thing about that that's really fascinating is that they don't change the entire piece of art. They'll relocate it somewhere else and change the sculpture of the face. This type of changing from one culture to another, or taking something from somebody else's rule and making it your own, putting your own face on it, is something that we call syncretism. Syncretism is a very important concept. We still see it today, and as much as I possibly can, I'll point it out to you in our examples. We're going to see lots of syncretism when we get to the Christian world. This is a relief sculpture on the back of the Arch of Constantine. It's a detail of the north frieze of the Arch of Constantine. It's solid marble, and it went underneath the attic in the sacred, or in the triumphal arch. Here you see Constantine and his court on the pedestal that's raised above the average group of people. The people are coming to Constantine, and Constantine's distributing largesse, which is sort of like charity, to the people around him. You can see that now not only do the plebeian people, or the people that are generalized in the ancient Roman world, the general group of plebeians, the larger of the social class, looks very similar to the portraits of the patricians. And so we're starting to get this new representation of patricians, with larger heads and larger hands and squattier bodies. This is because the patricians know that they are outnumbered by the plebeians who are following Christianity. Okay, that is it for the Roman Empire. Please look for Delve Deeper activity on Blackboard.